Yes, I can hear you. Oh, no, I need to find my notes, which I lost in the process of rebooting.
Stewie, can we up Leon's volume? Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Free Market Foundation. I am Jason Ebach, and I'm a director of the Free Market Foundation. We're here to talk about tales from the last century and how the FMF opposed apartheid. I wasn't around for much of that. I only joined the Free Market Foundation 14 years ago, and I'm going to use my MC prerogative just to tell you a bit about my background and how I came to be at the Free Market Foundation. So about 14 and a half years ago, a good friend of mine, Adrian Saville, was the publications editor of the Free Market Foundation, and he was also a lecturer of mine at Varsity and down at University of Natal, Durban. And the FMF was looking for interns, and Adrian said, well, I know this chap who might be suited to the job. And I came up to the Free Market Foundation when we were still based at Norwich Close, just off 5th Street in Sandton, and I came for an interview, and I was faced with the full might of the directors. There was Temba, Leon, and Eustace, and I remember having a really great conversation about ideas that I'd been harboring in my mind, although I'd come from a predominantly socialist university, and it was great to be amongst friends. And it's the same here tonight. It's great to be amongst friends at the Free Market Foundation. It's a very unusual situation for us because we normally face a lot of staunch opposition. And I'm sure later on we'll hear about what it was that sparked the ideas amongst my fellow directors and caused them to dedicate their lives to spreading ideas about freedom. We'll hear from Temba and Leon about their transition from Marxism through to free markets ideas and classical liberal principles. And, it often has its consequences. When you kind of start talking about ideas like this and it doesn't sit too well with a lot of your friends, then, well, that's it. So especially in the case of people like Temba, who came from a situation where it was really, really frowned upon to be a classical liberal or a libertarian in his case, and then to kind of nail your colours to the mast. So I'm sure we'll hear a lot of those stories, and I'm really proud and excited not only about the history of the Free Market Foundation, which we will hear about tonight, and but also about the future. And I'm really looking forward to the next 14 years. We've got a great bunch of guys like Martin and Chris coming through that do excellent work at the FMF, and we as directors are really proud of them. So without much further ado, I'd like to hand over to Eustace. If you'd like to have the first go, Eustace, of telling us about those ideas that caused you to dedicate your life to spreading ideas about freedom, that would be great. Thank you.
The people who promote freedom, these ideals, are quite a strange bunch, actually. I started off being quite normal, and I was a practicing accountant in a small town of Harrismith in the Free State. And the local priest lent my younger brother a book. And when he'd finished reading it, he came to me and he said, I think with your ideas, you should read this book. Well, that was quite an experience, because all sorts of things that I'd been wondering about and puzzling about sort of fell into place. But it didn't do me a lot of good. I became what Murray Rothbard, I was at a conference in Zurich in Switzerland, and he identified for me what I had become when I'd read that book. And he told us that it was the lone nut stage, where you've got these ideas and you try to talk to people and they look at you and their eyes glaze over and they start avoiding you, and you think, I haven't got any friends. I can't talk to people anymore because my ideas have changed so much. And then I saw an ad in the Financial Mail about a conference about free enterprise. Now, you need to know that back in those days, free enterprise was not very popular, especially with the National Party government. And I came to the conference, and I was met there by Professor Robert Toussinius, who warmly welcomed me. But when I started talking about my ideas, he backed away. Anyway, the next day the conference started, and I had come to hear about free enterprise and all these people promoting free enterprise and freedom. And what do you think I got? Speaker after speaker, talking about anything but. So partway through, I stood up and I said, Mr. Chairman, I came here and I thought I was going to hear about free enterprise. And all I hear is one speaker after the other talking about greater intervention in the economy. I said, I've paid good money. I came a long way to be here. I've wasted my time and I've wasted my money. There was kind of a silence it was a big conference. So the chairman said, no, you know, don't be like that, sort of thing. But a young guy jumped on the other side of the room, jumped to his feet. He said, I agree with the previous speaker, and he elaborated. And at tea time, he came across to me and he said, where on earth do you come from? That was Leon Lowe. That's how we met each other. And he went on to do a couple of things during that conference. There was a speaker who was, he spoke and he said everything had been private and had been nationalized. Anything you can think of. And a senior businessman said, Mr. Chairman, can we just, in this conference, stick to the truth? So Leon jumped up and he said, Mr. Chairman, can I read to you from Hansard, in which Minister Creswell moved for the nationalization of the railways? Because this gentleman had said, at least you can't say the railways were started by private enterprise. The man said, okay, and sat down. So Leon was right. Everything was private and was nationalized at some time or other. A bit later, there was another speaker. And he quoted from Ludwig von Mises, who's one of the gurus of the freedom and free market movement. A great economist he was. And it sounded as though he was promoting some kind of socialism. So the same young guy, he had a big black bag. He leans down and he pulls out a big book. He opens it up and he says, Mr. Chairman, can I complete that quote for our speaker? And Mises demolished, in the next paragraph, demolished everything that he'd said in the previous one. The speaker, when he was finished, turned on his heel and left. And he was a senior businessman. It took him, I think, 30 years to forgive Leon. So then I was invited to attend a meeting between Mr. Dirk Herzog, who was there, and the free market people. There was a chap called Mike Lillard, an American, Andre Spies and Mark Swanepoel, who were at the conference. So we met with Mr. Herzog. And he said, I admire your enthusiasm. And you've got very good ideas, but you're not going to get anywhere. He said, you have to have the business organizations and the businesses in this country supporting you. You've got to get their support. He was, at the time, chairman of the Chamber of Industries. And he said, I can do that for you. And they did. They went on to, he formed a committee. Michael O'Dowd, who later became our chairman, his picture's up in the boardroom over there. And they'd had a conference then to relaunch the Free Market Foundation. That was in 1977. The Free Market Foundation started in 1975. Relaunched the foundation and had a new board. And at that meeting, I was voted on to the council, as it was. So that's how I came to be involved. And I think then you can go on to somebody else now.
Okay. Timbo, would you like to pick up the mantle and carry on for the next, what are we on, 1977? Another 40 years, 41 years.
No, what about 1977?
No, I was just kidding. Go
Oh, I see. Yeah. When I joined the Free Market Foundation, I was looking for work, bottom line. The way I went about looking for work was to look in the newspapers where they were advertising job opportunities. So I saw this advertisement that said, facilitator wanted, call this number. There was no mention of the Free Market Foundation. So I called that number, and the number said, the phone said, look, leave your contact details and your name. This is the Free Market Foundation. Thank you. Ugh, Free Market Foundation? What the blazes is going on here? But for me, I was looking for work. I was looking for bread. That was the bottom line. And so I called and left my contact details, and Jenny Harris, who was the manager of the Free Market Foundation's training division in Cape Town, followed up and set up an appointment to meet with me. And there I was, I presented myself, and Jenny was there and had two other colleagues. So she said to me, oh, we do have a vacancy here, as a facilitator to run courses, workshops that are designed to impart knowledge and pertaining to the business enterprise and just provide and demystify the whole concept of the entity of a business enterprise, what it's about, and to impart knowledge on the basis of business literacy and economic literacy. Anyway, what is your background, Themba Noluchungu? And I said, I'm going to be honest with you. So what I said to her was, look, I have always been a Marxist. And I have always been also simultaneously at the same time being an anarchist. I have always believed and embraced what Proudhon and Bakunin, the anarchist philosopher, Bakunin and Proudhon had said, property is theft. Property is theft. That's my background. And she said, please elaborate on that, enlighten me more. I want more details. And I said, I used to run workshops, in the townships that focus on the study of Marxism. And I studied Marxism very, very, very carefully. The first book that I read by Karl Marx was Grundrisse, and the second one was Das Kapital. That was heavy going. And so I became acquainted with the concept of the materialist conception of history, otherwise known as historical materialism, and about exploitation, about alienation, and all of that stuff. I embraced that fully. And this was what actually drove me. And so, imbued with that sense of mission to bring about a Marxist, socialist, communist dispensation in this country, one of the things that happened was that we formed a black consciousness oriented organization that was known as the Black Mamba Youth Movement. Now, we were very aggressive in terms of our mission in the context of the Black Mamba Youth Movement, and this is how we greeted each other whenever we came across each other, be it in town, and that got some people a bit frightened or curious as to what we were signifying by this gesture. So these would be the fangs of the Black Mamba. And so with a lot of rigor, like this, that's how we would greet each other. So I gave Jenny Harris my background, and she said, oh, go on. And I went on and on. She was listening very intently. And afterwards she said, okay, fine, this interview is over. Now you can go back home now. So,
what year was this?
This was in 1989 when I joined the Free Market Foundation. So that interview was over. She said, oh, well, we may call or may not call you. And then I went away. Unknown to me, Jenny Harris called Leon over there. Said, Leon, I have just had an encounter with this guy known as Themba Nolichungu. This is his background. Leon said, no, don't ever grant him another interview. That guy is going to sabotage everything. He's going to mess up the Free Market Foundation. That's what Leon said. I got to know about that only after some time. And Jenny told me afterwards that she just had this feeling, this instinct, that the Free Market Foundation needed somebody like me with that kind of background, because she felt that I would be able to engage people coming on the course who would be articulating socialist, statist, arguments. And that's what happened. So afterwards, but let me just go back to the second interview. So I get this call now from Jenny Harris. Jenny Harris says, Themba, okay, I'm actually thinking that we should hire you. And I said, oh, go ahead. And she gave me a couple of books for me to take home with me. One of those books is a book by Professor Walter Williams, a US black economist. And for me, the fact that he was black was significant, coming from my kind of political background, the black consciousness background, Black Mamba, black and I'm proud. And so I read that book. The title of the book was South Africa's War Against Capitalism. For me, it was difficult to comprehend the title of the book. How could it be? Could it have been South Africa's war against capitalism? Because here, apartheid was capitalism. That's what I believed in. I had it all so wrong. I was to realize later it was so wrong. But I will elaborate on that later. Anyway, I got the job. So there I am a facilitator. And I'm armed with these books. And one other book was one by Milton Friedman, the late US economist, and the title of the book was Free to Choose. Now that book is also so well written in a very axiomatic manner that anybody could understand who knew a smattering of English. and I took those books and I read them. At the same time, what was happening to me was I was looking and studying what was happening throughout the world. And this was the fact that you had people from the socialist bloc countries, meaning the communist countries, going across to the capitalist countries, the capitalist West. And there was no movement in the opposite direction. And I said to myself, no, there's something amiss about the socialist systems here that I'm missing out on big time, and that I had to try to find out as to what was happening, what could account for that state of affairs. And you had people from all walks of life who were crossing from the communist countries to the capitalist countries, where I believe that there was unencumbered exploitation of people. And so you looked at as East Germany, you looked at West Germany, people from the communist Germany moving across, scaling the Berlin Wall and tunneling under the Berlin Wall, some of them, many of them being killed in the process. Nothing happening in the opposite direction. Same people, same culture, Germans, all of them, same language, almost in all respects the same people. But East Germany was an economic disaster. West Germany had become the second biggest economy in the world after the Second World War. And that if you juxtaposed North Korea and South Korea, same people, Koreans, same language, same culture, relatives on both sides. South Korea, economically prosperous, North Korea, an economic abyss. Socialist country, capitalist country. That got me fired up in terms of delving deeper into as to what made the capitalist system tick. And so with that, really, that kind of turmoil that I was in, I went to the West German consulate in Cape Town and I said, I have this dilemma. Could you help me out? Because I want to know why it is you have all these East Germans walking across to West Germany. Could you explain this to me? Could you demystify this to me? And so they said, oh yeah, you've come to the right place. They gave me a couple of books and booklets and so on. I sat down with one of the diplomats who explained to me as to what was happening. And so remember, I'm working still for the Free Market Foundation. And so I went home and studied. Now, I'm a voracious reader. And even right up to this day, I make it a point, sometimes I fail to do that, to read at least one book a week. One book a week. So I read quite a lot. I used to read quite a great deal at that time. So I'm going through, I have sleepless nights because for me, this has precipitated an internal intellectual turmoil within me. I couldn't sleep that well because I felt that, look, I've been immersed in the thought of Marxism. And now here is some reality that challenges that Marxist paradigm. So there was that internal conflict that had to be resolved within. And so I will come up with a follow-up in terms of what happened afterwards. Maybe at this juncture, I should hand over to Eustace or Leon, or over to you, Jason, as the facilitator. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that was a fascinating journey. Thank you, Timber, for telling us that story. What I've just realized is that the common thread that runs through all of this is Leon, because on that first day when I came up for the interview, Eustace, Timber and Leon asked me to stay afterwards, and Leon gave this talk about the economic freedom of the world. And it was really that presentation that really resonated with me and got me thinking about some of the more kind of empirical underpinnings of the freedom movement. And I think Leon really is an unsung hero in South African history, and hopefully now he'll talk about some of his background and talk about some landmark books such as The Solution that he wrote that really did change the face of South Africa and got people thinking about the transition from apartheid through to democracy. So I'll hand over to you, Leon.
Yes, thank you, Eustace and Temba and Jason and the guests. I'm going to, and I'm sorry I'm not there, very sorry indeed, but technology allows for this. I'm going to say a little bit about our prehistory because I think the foundation itself needs to be understood as something that had roots, and what were those roots. Temba has not mentioned and is about to finish a book on his prehistory, which was in the armed struggle as a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary. My prehistory was coming from a nationalistic pro-apartheid family and background, and going to Wits University, where my father wanted me to go and my brothers to learn to speak English properly. He considered that an important thing to do. And there I was converted myself, like Timber, to Marxism, became a young communist student activist, and in that period, young black South Africans today have no knowledge of the sort of thing that was happening. Wits University, where I was, had something like 7,000 students in many marches against apartheid. The big one, called the Grand March, I think it was, headed by John Cain Berman, who until recently was head of the Institute of Race Relations, was basically every single white student at the university marched. Virtually all of them marched against apartheid, and the students were all white at the time by law. And so yes, there was a considerable anti-apartheid movement amongst white South Africans, which is nowadays not recognized. My own conversion from Marxism was an odd one, which happened at about the time I was meeting other people who were discovering capitalism and libertarianism and the great philosophy of Ayn Rand objectivism, was seeing a street trader being driven off the streets by the old apartheid police, and wondering why I found that so obnoxious. I intervened, I battled with the police, got myself arrested, eventually got involved in fighting for street traders, which I do to this very day. But what struck me was not some great philosophical book from Mises or Hayek or Ayn Rand or Milton Friedman or whatever, or Thomas Sowell, who's now my intellectual guru and hero, but seeing a woman driven off the streets for selling fruit. And I then thought, but hold on a sec, as a Marxist, I should be against this. And it struck me that what she was doing was being a capitalist, and capitalism was simply the right of people to interact with each other economically, consenting acts between adults, or consenting capitalist acts between adults. And then I thought, well, is there a difference in her and a big business? And it seemed no. Why shouldn't any two people, either big or small, be free to transact with each other as they wish? And Marxism, which I was then for, was against that. So that was what got me changing and then talking to various people, and I won't go into their history, but eventually a few young South Africans who were libertarians, objectivists, and people like me, in some process of morphing out of being a Marxist. At the time, Temba was probably still deeply involved in the armed struggle in the West Cape. And I then heard all sorts of other odd things. Albert Wessels, who founded the Toyota company in South Africa, blamed the National Party government of creeping socialism. So I thought, well, hold on, what's going on here? If I'm against apartheid, I'm supposed to be for socialism, and yet here's a white Afrikaner business leader blaming the apartheid regime for being socialist. It was all somewhat philosophically and ideologically bewildering. I then ended up being the legal advisor of ASSOCOM, now SACI, the business movement, Chamber of Commerce movement. And there I encountered Raymond Parsons, who is now a professor of economics at Potch University, and to this day a Keynesian, and that helped me move a bit more away from communism. And then various things led together. Andreas Wassenaar, who's I think there with you now, Robert Wassenaar, his father Andreas, head of Sanlam at the time, wrote an astounding book called Assault on Private Enterprise, again accusing the apartheid regime of assaulting private enterprise. These influences were quite phenomenal. not only for me personally, which is the unimportant part, but for South Africa as a whole. And there were all these, let's say, Afrikaner leaders, and eventually I got to meet Rupert and Oppenheimer. And between them, they decided there had to be a foundation in South Africa, a formal movement to promote free enterprise against the supposed enemies, communists and socialists, and against the apartheid regime. I came across Ayn Rand's description of racism as being inherently socialist because by its definition, racism lumps people together and ignores their individualism. So here we had then a supposed right-wing capitalist, Ayn Rand, saying that racism is socialism. So you can imagine the intellectually bewildering state of affairs people like me, young students, young activists, people seeking justice and fairness in the world, and ideology and philosophy were plunged into. Having been in the anti-apartheid movement, I'd got to know many wonderful people. The trade unionist Len Mosala, who I discovered recently is still alive in his 90s and promoting agriculture amongst informal people. And Sam Motsunyane, who's still our president, Dr. Sam Motsunyane, also in his 90s, who was then one of the rising stars in what became known as not ACHIB, the Chamber of Informal Hawkers, but Lawrence Mavundla is now the president of, and is now one of our board members, NAFCOC, the National African Federated Chambers of Commerce. And Sam Motsunyane became the president, and I was then involved with black business people, eminent luminaries at the time, Solly Lesolong, Gabe Mokoko, and many others. And then I got involved with Percy Koboza, who was the editor of the newspaper called The World, a black, obviously anti-apartheid newspaper coming out of Soweto. I'll never forget the heading once in the Rand Daily Mail. I think Raymond Lowe, who might be amongst you there, then editor of Rand Daily Mail, had this wonderful heading that said, "Jimmy Kruger bans the world." And the entire world was banned by him, which of course the newspaper called The World. It became eventually the Sowetan, and the subsequent editor, Agri Claster, also became a friend. My first meeting by this stage with the Free Market Foundation was in its early years, and Eustace was with us, Temba not quite yet. With Percy Koboza, the editor, was quite fascinating and revealing of how South Africa was. We wanted to meet, and he was going to be coming from the office in Soweto, or near Soweto, just outside it in Industria, to Johannesburg to meet with me, but there was nowhere public where a white and a black person could lawfully meet. We could not sit on a park bench, they were whites or blacks only. We could not go into a restaurant, none of them were then what later became known as international and therefore mixed. So there was no fair lawful, and even if we stood on the sidewalk, as we tried to do talking, the police would come and separate us because that was called the crime of loitering. So we eventually found you could meet in a private home or a private office. We met in a small anti-apartheid legal activist office sitting in a tiny little gloomy reception area. That's where we got to know each other, and eventually I used to visit Solly Lesolong and Percy Koboza and others in the black anti-apartheid movement in Soweto, became members of the Committee of 10. Makana Shabalala, who was with the Black Business Organization in Soweto, and Richard Maponya and others, Habakkuk Shakwani, who ran an informal cane furniture making business in his backyard in Soweto, eventually became a very big and successful businessman. Lawrence Mavundla, who'd been a trade unionist, became a street trader. He and I became close friends and are to this day. And we both remember the ghastly incident of Granny Moyo, who was this old street vendor. When she was thrown into the back of a police van, she cracked her head on the far side and died, and she became a sort of icon of the anti-apartheid black business movement. And I don't want to make it sound as if the Free Market Foundation was all about race and apartheid. Unfortunately, a lot in South Africa is. No, we worked for freeing the market. It didn't really matter to us what race people were or gender or whatever. We just wanted people to be free. and we wanted them in particular to be economically free. Other people were fighting for other types of freedom, civil liberties, rule of law, natural justice, and so on. We were involved, for example, with the white trade union movement at the time, TAXA. Joan, whose birthday it is today, who's with the Free Market Foundation to this day, used to work for the trade union movement, and she is now one of our stalwarts. And the Trade Union Council was eventually integrated and merged with others, and the Vion and Rickett commissions, which we fought for, brought about the freeing up of the labor movement in South Africa to have trade unions. And that's why people of our generation do not regard trade unions as somehow anti-free market. This myth has arisen. On the contrary, free market people were very clear at the time that the right to form unions is no different from the right to form business organizations. People should be free to make formations to represent their interests. Through that association with the labor movement, I became friends with Cyril Ramaphosa, now our president. He was then, before that, he was a legal articled clerk in Johannesburg. I knew him through the Articled Clerks Association, of which he and I were on the committee. And then he became the Secretary General of the National Union of Mine Workers. And I used to meet regularly in their office with him. We became friends. We had a monthly lunch. And I think he's one of the people who knows what the history of the Free Market Foundation was, and therefore doesn't have some of the perverse views that others who are unfamiliar with that history would have. We were instrumental to bringing about some of the black business deregulation. It was quite extraordinary. We were, for example, Richard Maponya ran a little trading store in Soweto. It was subject to what was called a radius law. No two black traders could be within 4 miles of each other. They had to operate from a small premises, not more than 40 square yards as it was in those days, and it had to be whitewashed. And even if they were selling car parts, they used to have a 6-monthly health checkup. The laws were quite beyond anything imaginable today, and we fought successfully against many of those. Systematic deregulation of black business started, and we were main role players. The informal sector is a battle we've never won. The informal sector still has to operate unlawfully out of backyards and homes and spazas and tuck shops and street corners. And to this day, we continue that fight. We, the Free Market Foundation, were instrumental to getting the Constitutional Court order forcing the Johannesburg City Council to let street traders back onto the streets when they were cleared away by the Johannesburg City Council's cleansing department. In other words, human beings were taken off the streets as if they are rubbish and litter. That is, to this day, under the new South Africa, that is still how decent human beings doing something honest and harmless are treated and thought of. And in case anyone's wondering if it was the DA or the ANC, it doesn't really matter to us. It happened to be when it was an ANC council, and we now still fight against the present council and all councils for the rights of informal businesses and trade. One of the people I became knowledgeable of and friendly with, well, there was Albertina Zulu. We, the Free Market Foundation, used to help informal farmers, people growing crops in the backyards of Soweto. With the Albertina Zulu, we distributed used wheelbarrows and seeds and things from donors in the leafy suburbs of Johannesburg. Dikgang Mozeneke was PAC. He was president, I think, at that time. We became very friendly with him and are friendly to this day with people at that level. So those are the sorts of people with whom we routinely rubbed shoulders. They were our friends and with whom we fought and collaborated, not just against apartheid, I want to stress that, but for freedom. We weren't particularly against apartheid, and the book that Jason referred to, South Africa, the Solution, and other books that I co-authored with my wife Frances, and other books I worked on separately, were about freedom. And when we went to Dakar, for example, I was one of the Dakarites at the famous Dakar conference. I was one of the 4 people who presented papers there. Mine was on constitutional models, and it was in the wake of the book The Solution And what we tried to do there was to say to be anti-apartheid was simple and obvious. You didn't have to be clever to be anti-apartheid. The real challenge was what to replace it with. And that is probably what the Free Market Foundation did best, was to say to people, these are better ideas. This is what you can do instead. Have checks and balances in the democracy, and have personal freedom, and have less government patronage. That would mean less racism and so on. We fought with the taxi industry. Terry Markman, who might be there, became involved with us. He was a transport engineer, and we were involved in the early days of the taxis. They were largely big cars. They used to ride around with people in the boots of these cars, old Ford Fairlanes and Chryslers and so on. And then the combi taxis emerged, and we were at the forefront of fighting for their rights. When transition started under P.W. Botha, we were then very involved, as it happens, with Winnie Mandela and the football team, and we were delivering hampers and parcels to the families of detainees in Soweto. And we tried to persuade the government to introduce full freehold title, as we still do. 25 years after apartheid, black people still do not get to own their land. There's something really perverse that seems like almost nobody can imagine black people just being landowners like white people are. Not even black government or black government that's meant to be trendy, progressive, radical, and anti-racism. But anyway, they did at least introduce 99-year leases, and that was a huge step forward, and we were significant role players in that at the Free Market Foundation. We were significant role players in getting the old agricultural boards. All agricultural products had to be marketed through these control boards at controlled prices, and there were some insane boards. There was a dried bean board, a soya bean board, a regular bean board, a leguminous bean board, and as I used to say, they all belonged to the has-been board. So and Winnie Mandela became a personal house friend. She wrote a foreword, a wonderful glowing foreword for the book South Africa, the Solution. And Mandela himself, for those who don't know, became a convert to free market economics. We like to believe, we flatter ourselves in believing that we contributed to that. He had read the solution, the draft, and had agreed before Winnie was still in prison to Winnie writing the foreword, which she did. And it's there for all to see. And when the people in the movement tried to persuade her not to write a foreword for us, we had a meeting with their lawyers and various radical leaders, and she says, it's time you all knew what I believe in. Now, that was, one can say, did she really? But she was very adamant that she was a free marketeer and was going to endorse our hardcore, not just free market, but libertarian book. And then there were other issues, like we produced, Temba helped me with this, both of us grew up with the Freedom Charter, both of us thinking the Freedom Charter was a sellout to liberals and capitalists, and it was a compromise to the right. And today we have people thinking the Freedom Charter is a socialist document, which is really weird, because the person who wrote the economic provisions in it, Ben Turok, has explained that it was, none of the words were intended to be socialist. Mandela, Sisulu, Albert Luthuli, all of them, Govan Mbeki, Thabo Mbeki's father, also a friend of ours, as a communist, he said at the time, 1956, that the Freedom Charter did not recommend socialism, that when it said property should belong, mines and land and banks and businesses should belong to the people, that the people was not the government. It meant the people. People should own land and mines, South Africans. And it was never defined more than that. People like Ben Turok wanted them to be localized, local ownership. And that was paradoxically also the National Party's policy, what they called domestication. So there were some strange similarities, but it was never nationalization and never socialism, and we knew that well. And so it's very strange and paradoxical to hear young black people now thinking the Freedom Charter is about socialism and nationalization. And then finally, if I may say, we pride ourselves on what has been accomplished in South Africa. A lot of it we think is thanks to us. And And we point out that a lot more has been accomplished than is recognized. People talk about little has changed or nothing has changed, or this absolute nonsense that there's growing inequality and that white people still own everything. It's just empirical rubbish, and you can't be flattering about it, but we have to fight it. We have to try and get the actual facts out there, that when liberated, black South Africans, of course, benefited from liberation. The idea that things got worse after liberation is an insane idea. It actually means that the ANC and the black government are as bad for black people as apartheid. Now, what would that tell us? It's kind of nuts. The reality is that huge improvements have taken place, massively. More than half of all properties now being bought on the stock exchange, the buyers are black people. Some calculations put the number of shares directly and indirectly owned by black people on the stock exchange at now over 50%, which is a more realistic calculation. And no matter what you look at, life expectancy, square meters of housing, access to motorized transport, access to telecommunications, electricity, water, etc., waterborne sewerage, by all of these metrics, all of these objective statistics and data, black South Africans have, through the market, not so much through government, but through the market, advanced spectacularly. And what we need people to understand is that by far the best friend of the poor, by far the best friend of every individual, regardless of race or gender, is in South Africa and everywhere the market being maximally free. Now, many of our friends, Dakar, who will be giving a talk at the Free Market Foundation quite soon, and others might not themselves consider themselves free marketeers, but they do consider themselves friends with us on questions of rule of law, natural justice, due process, civil liberties, democracy, and certainly basic concepts of property rights and opportunity, especially for lower income people, to rise. What do we do now? And I just want to move on to the present and the recent aspects, and we now fight some really nutty ideas like the Financial Services Controls, the Financial Services Board, now being turned into an even bigger, more oppressive monster that keeps essentially any newcomer, white or black, out of the services of financial markets, and imposes immense costs which have to be borne by the consumers always. It's always the consumers are the victim, and of course the bigger victims proportionately are the poor. And so we fight that. We have to now fight, we're trying to fight exchange control. I wish I could get it into the Constitutional Court. Unfortunately, Mark Shuttleworth's case didn't really fight the principle of the constitutionality, it fought a technicality. And things like exchange control, invented by Hitler, imported into South Africa to fight for apartheid, to promote oppression, to stop the anti-apartheid movement, getting access to foreign funds. I am right now, as we speak, I got some money into South Africa. My bank called me and said, Mr. Lowe, what's this money for? And I said, well, it is for my services as a male prostitute that I've been paid. I am a prostitute and this is reward for my overseas services. Well, of course, we're shocked. And what it really was a refund of an air ticket, but don't worry about that. That's not as much fun. And I'm now wanting them to take me to court. I'm saying that they've refused to deposit my money. They've put it in trust. They're threatening to send it back, which they can't do because the chap who sent it to me sent it from a company he was about to wind up. So they can't send it back where it came from. And so watch the space. We might end up in the Constitutional Court over me being a male prostitute and being paid for services rendered. And when someone in the bank phoned me and said, but Mr. Lowe, we can't accept this money because it was illegal. So I said, but I didn't tell you in which country I performed these services. So how did they know? Anyway, we are for principles and laws. We often get people confused when we fight, for example, for the rights of smokers. And it actually has nothing to do with smokers. It has the rights to control their own body. That is what we want and what we fight for. And that does not mean that we are oblivious to the need to protect innocent people. Of course we are. As I like to say, We believe that you can wave your fist around in the air, but not where our noses are, and you can blow your smoke around in the air, but not where our noses are. And you should be free to drink and be obese and have unprotected sex and have sugar and salt and all of the things that the draconian, and I don't apologize for using such a word, despotic, I don't apologize for that, minister against health, Motsoaledi, does not attach any value to personal freedom, rights or liberty or to bodily integrity. These are draconian people who want to regulate everybody's lifestyle, and eventually you will have compulsory exercise, obesity will be banned, and only marital sex will be allowed, because obviously unprotected premarital sex is more dangerous than smoking. And the latest thing, by the way, the World Health Organization, which is their guru, has announced that sitting, which is what all of you are doing now, or most of you, except maybe Stuart, what you are doing is as unhealthy as smoking. Sitting is the new smoking. So we're going to get the same regulations will come. We'll have chair taxes. People will be required to stand up regularly at work and so on. So yes, it's a long history. It's a proud history. It is a lot of it has been because of South Africa's history about race and about promoting and fighting for non-racialism, but that has just been a byproduct of our essential belief and principle in human prosperity, progress and freedom. We look around the world and we see that always and everywhere where the markets are freer, people prosper, and people always and everywhere migrate in only one direction, as Temba said right at the beginning, from markets that are less free to markets that are more free. And so the poor know where to go. The poor know something that leftist intellectuals don't. Leftist intellectuals include virtually every academic nowadays. And the poor know that the place to be poor is where other people are rich. They go from where the gap between the rich and the poor is small to where the gap is big. And they want to go to where the CEOs earn the most, not where the CEOs earn the least. And they want to go to the places where 1 billion human beings have risen in the last 20 years from destitution to the middle class, and in which starvation and real poverty have vanished from the planet. Older people here know and can remember when the average newscast had pictures of starving people all over the world, Eritrea, Bangladesh, Africa, Chad, and so on. Young people today, probably the ones right there, Jason and others who we consider young, have probably never seen a picture of a starving person. We had them as regular newscasts. So the markets around the world and in South Africa have lifted the poor spectacularly. We were right, our enemies were wrong. Temba and I were wrong. We became right when we converted from Marxist, Leninist revolutionaries to free market, libertarian, classical liberals. And we are proud in the Free Market Foundation of our history and intend to continue that legacy and to continue to be both philosophically and morally sound and practically effective. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I don't want to keep you around for too much longer, but there are a few things that I'd like to chat about some more if you want to stick around, but please feel free to leave if you'd like to go. But in a moment I'd like to ask Eustace to talk about our KLM project and our transition from being largely a think tank into doing stuff on the ground, so being a do tank. But before I ask Eustace to speak about that, I think it's important to perhaps take a step back and just look at the history about how it came to be that we have Section 25 within the Constitution and a property rights clause. So I'd just like Temba to kick off that discussion and just speak briefly about the role that the FMF played, which is arguably, in my opinion, the biggest feather in our cap. I mean, we've been highly influential over the years. We've deregulated the trading environment and things that we take for granted. Going to a shop on a Sunday afternoon, or on a Sunday rather, that was in large part due to the Free Market Foundation. But if Tembe, I think the expropriation without compensation is a hot topic at the moment, and it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on the history of how the Section 25 was included in the Constitution, and obviously Leon played an instrumental role in that as well.
Perhaps, Eustace, as we had discussed, you might want to just share some kind of your experience in terms of how we got that process underway in terms of engaging the government at the time on the basis of having the property rights clause enshrined in the Constitution. Just mention what you said to me, then I'll take off from there.
Well, very simple. Temba phoned me one day while they were busy discussing the final Constitution, and said to me, "You won't believe what's happening. They have omitted the property rights clause from the final Constitution, and all the other political parties seem to have agreed with it," which we knew would be an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
So,
okay. Oh, sorry. Please go on.
so I passed this on to Leon, and what happened then was a gathering in Cape Town, organized by the Free Market Foundation, and who was helping? The ASICOM, I think.
Yeah,
Yes.
it was the Afrikaans Handels Institute.
They got
It
involved
was-
at your
yes.
request, yes.
Yeah, all right.
So all the people gathered
Yeah.
in Cape Town to talk to the committee, the Constitutional Committee, and Temba and Leon were there, and some of the pictures of them during this engagement you'll see in the boardroom.
Okay, let me take you from there onwards, Eustace. What we did was to constitute a kind of ad hoc business caucus with the sole purpose of motivating a case for the property rights clause to be enshrined in the Constitution. With that in mind, we assembled the organizations like the AHI, African Handels Institute, and we got some top industrialists, South African industrialists such as Marinus Darling to be part of that, and many others, and we got the South African Property Owners Association to be part of that business caucus. And we said to them, there is only one thing that we would like you to focus on, and that is to motivate a case, I repeat this, for the property rights clause to be in the Constitution. Don't think about anything else, because if we are able to accomplish this and everything else is disastrous in terms of what the Constitution might be about, we will have reason to sit back and say, wow, at least our properties are protected in the Constitution. They can never ever be expropriated by any government, such as had happened when we had the Native Land Act of 1913 enacted in this country. And so we organized meetings with the Nationalist Party at the time, and at the time it was F.W. de Klerk who was at the helm of the party. And it was meetings with the DP at the time. At the time, Tony Leon was at the helm of the DP. And then the business caucus people said, okay, that's fine. We've met with the key people. No, we didn't stop there in terms of the Free Market Foundation's agenda. So we interacted with the IFP. We interacted with all the political parties. We interacted with the Freedom Front. And when you see pictures that show the Freedom Front leaders at the time, and like General Constant Viljoen, that's part of that story of the Free Market Foundation's initiative to have the property rights clause enshrined in the Constitution. Now, we had a problem afterwards, because the ANC was of the view that a property rights clause in the Constitution had everything to do with the protection of white property, who were the haves, and nothing to do with the interests of the have-nots, who were black people. Now, with that, we were engaging Baleka Mbete as an individual, and then it was Naledi Pandor. And then it was, at that time, her name was Nadia Pandor, but Naledi Pandor, who I got to know very, very well. And then it was also with Cyril Ramaphosa, that meeting with just him. And they were all articulating the sentiment that, oh, well, property rights clause, you don't need in the Constitution. It's about the protection of white privilege, white property, and all of that stuff. We said to them that, look, currently you, Baleka, and you, Cyril, you own properties. There's no denying that. There are also other black people who own properties, however big or small. There are also other people who have investments in various investment vehicles in this country. Now, let us say, as we are accumulating all this wealth, all these properties, after a couple of elections down the line, and we do not have a property rights clause that protects properties in the Constitution, there is now crystallizing a totally different government to what we have in mind, and that government might comprise, say, the Nguni-speaking and the Afrikaners or the English-speaking, who might have all sorts of nefarious agendas against some other sectors of the population. And there we are now old and grey, we have accumulated all this wealth and we want to bequeath it to our own children or grandchildren. We will be very vulnerable because there will be no protection of that property. So we emphasize the point that, look, when it comes to the Constitution, because this is the supreme law of the country, because this is a law of general application, you need to take a long-term view of the Constitution. And so the penny dropped. We got them to actually be receptive to the idea of having a property rights clause in the Constitution, and we felt good about that. However, let me just also explain about the Free Market Foundation's modus operandi when we go about advocating free market-oriented, libertarian-oriented policies, by me relating what happened, winding the clock back. So I'm working for the Free Market Foundation as a facilitator. And there are people that I used to rub shoulders with during the anti-apartheid struggle, from the ANC, PAC, you name them. And they were saying to me, Themba, how come? What's happening here? We see that you're working for this capitalist organization, and what's going on with you? You used to be a Marxist. What's happened to you? And I would say to them, look, I'll tell you what, I'd like us to have a discussion, a debate over this. On, it could be at my place. If you could come to the office, they would say, no, many of them, no, I can't come to the capitalist office there. I will not come there. Let's meet somewhere else. And some, would come to the office, and I'd say to them, look, let us have a rational, objective debate. And so I would say, look, I'll tell you what, we were involved in the struggle against apartheid. What sort of ideas, what aspirations, socio-economic, political aspirations did we have in mind in terms of the dispensation that we aspire to? We wanted to be able to choose every individual where they could go to look for work, where they could start a business, whatever kind of business they wanted to start, where they could send their kids, which schools that they could send their kids to, where they could live, in other words, just being able to move around freely. And here we have a situation where we are in this apartheid dispensation, on the receiving end of it. We have a government that is omnipotent, is all-powerful. This is the government that dictates as to where you could go to look for work, what category of work you could be employed in, a government that decided where you could live as a black person, a government that decided where you could be born, like being born in a non-white designated hospital, a government that decided where you could work, a government that decided where you could be buried when you died because you were buried in a black cemetery. So from the cradle to the grave, the government controlled every aspect of black life. So we had been nationalized black people have been nationalized by the apartheid government, then I'll say, you see, we got it all so wrong, because all those ideas that we had in mind in terms of a democratic, open society, where their people would be free to do whatever they wanted to do in terms of pursuing their own socio-economic aspirations, all this is not to be found within the socialist Marxist paradigm, not at all. It's about free markets. Then I would say, you know, free markets, what the free market is? A free market is just simply a situation, a dispensation. It is not an ideology. It is a spontaneous order, as Friedrich Hayek would call it, but then I would demystify and explain that. It just simply means you do whatever you want to do, so long as whatever you engage in terms of your relationship with your fellow humans, that does not entail force or fraud. That's what I would say. And then I was armed with the experiences of other countries, socialist countries. When I went to Czechoslovakia in 1991, went to Prague, and I arrived at the Ruzhny airport. That airport was so downtrodden, it was like a kind of horse stable. I just couldn't believe that in Europe there was such a downtrodden, such a dilapidated airport. And there I was. I went to the hotel in Wenceslas Square in Prague. And there in that dilapidated hotel, if you looked around, you looked at this city that used to be a magnificent, beautiful city, and now was in a state of dilapidation in terms of the buildings, wherever you looked around. And then at the hotel that I stayed in, the Ambassador Lata Husa Hotel, they did not know the concept of service. So I'm there, you know, for breakfast, and they are the waiters who didn't know what to do. And I had to go over to them to say, I'm hungry, I need some food. And then they served me. Now, fast forward to 8 years later, when I went to that country with a group of parliamentarians, I just could not comprehend the magnificent changes that had taken place. That Ruzhny the airport was so fantastic. It was glittering, it was beautiful. And driving to Wenceslas Square, going to the same hotel I had stayed in, it was so wonderful. It was magnificent. It was beautiful. The service was professional. And looking around at the buildings, the spires pointing up, and it was so wonderful. It was so great. And then I knew what had happened, of course, and this was the fact that in that country, under the leadership of the president and premier and prime minister of that country, Václav Havel and Václav Klaus, they had adopted free market-oriented policies. Within 8 years, the changes were so visible for the better. 1991, I go to Moscow because I wanted to really be able to see the ravages of the communist system. And there, arriving at the Sheremetyevo airport, for me it was again this very bad airport. But anyway, on my way to the hotel where I was staying, I had hired the services of somebody who was going to drive me around. And I asked him, what is it like in terms of the economy? He said, no economy here. That's what he said, no economy here. And so I did not see much economic activity at all. I didn't. So I'm at the hotel the following day. I've arranged with this guy to take me out to areas where there might be some businesses, and so he takes me to a pocket of informal trading. And there is a guy who's selling bread. I can't remember how many rubles per loaf he was selling at. And from the back of his truck, he was charging, at that time when I first encountered him, something like, I can't remember whether it was 10 rubles. The following day, I went to the same person, and he was charging more than the 10 rubles for the same loaf of bread. So I asked, what has happened? Because I had observed that the queue, the demand that is for his bread was even longer. And he said to me, well, I can't understand why I'm charging more. I said, I think you're a capitalist. I think you're exploiting people. I think you're overcharging. I said, but explain to me why you're doing this. And he said, oh, I don't have the answer. Now, the third day, the guy was charging more, and that coincided with the queue being longer. And I asked him the very same basic question, and his response was, I give up. I just find myself doing it. Now, what that means is that, for me, there was great insight in that. It means that, the free market is a natural state of affairs for people to operate in. People want to be free to pursue the businesses they want to pursue, and that the law of demand and supply is one of those laws that operate in the economic arena. And people respond according to that law of demand and supply. So there is great demand for what you are selling, and that correlates with an increase in the prices that you're charging. And so I would then, now being engaged by the people who used to be ex-comrades who were engaging me, I would say, look, now I've explained this, let me just try to relate to this to a township context. You, my friend, you decide that I can't find work, and you go to the market and you buy a bag of oranges, and you are going to say you charge 10 cents per orange. Now the following day, you go and buy the same box, the same what you call amount of oranges for the same price that you had bought them at. And you go to the same venue, and you find that the queue is longer. People have been waiting for your juicy, delicious oranges. What are you going to do? That is how I would engage them. And at some point, the person would say, I would charge more than 10 cents, but that's bad. This would be a socialist saying this, a communist saying this. I would say, you see, now you can see that the free market is a spontaneous, natural state of affairs. It's a spontaneous order. And that's what would get people to start embracing the free market paradigm. And yeah, I could say more. I don't want to take too much time. Otherwise I could talk forever. But the point is, people have to understand, and policymakers will not understand, will be obstinate, will refuse to understand that the free market is the natural state of affairs, and that the free market actually delivers. There is empirical evidence that attests to that fact. Otherwise, if we pursue in this country policies that are antithetical to free markets, which means economic freedom, which means liberty for individuals in the economic arena, we're going to end up with the consequences of negative policies that we pursue in this country. Thank you. Sorry about that, Jason. But I was not as long as Leon there.
So I'd like to start wrapping up so that we can do some Q&A. But just before we get onto that, could I just have a few more words from Eustace and Leon, and then we can go into the Q&A session. Eustace?
Okay. As you can see, the free market paradigm is something you can talk about forever. Just a couple of incidents in my life. As I said, I was practicing as an accountant and auditor in the town of Hare, and I get this call one morning from one of my clients, and he says, Eustace, please, you've got to come to the farm immediately. I said, oh, what's wrong? No, just come. I'll tell you when you get here. So I rush out to the farm, and he takes me to the far corner of his big lounge. He says to me, you know what happened last night? He said, I had the police here, gave a bribe for the police. He said, I do it so that I can at least get some service when something goes wrong at the farm. And he said, there were two plainclothes people there. and eventually said to them, well, how do you fit in? So they said, we're from the special branch. Special branch? Yeah? Harry Smith? Oh, he said, yeah, it must be Lesotho and Kwakwa and those areas. No, no, not only that. They said, you mean in the town? Yes. So he said, like who? So there's no continue. So the other police left and these two left, and he, after many years, he asked them the question again. I said, no, we can't. But then I said, oh, but he said, I'm the chairman of the National Party in the area here. You can trust me. Tell me. So my name came out. You mean Eustace Davey, the accountant? You got him under surveillance? Yes. You tap his phone? Yes. The reason was that I was on the Council of the Free Market Foundation, so I had become a danger. Anyway, so I started laughing. So I said, this is not funny. Let me tell you. Please, you've got to be careful. He said, these people are dangerous. I know. I still, I went, well, thanks for letting me know. Now I know that my phone's being tapped, so I've got to be careful what I say. Probably they were very interested when Leon and I were talking to each other. But this came home to me some years later. David Webster, who taught at Wits University, he wrote this: assassinations used as one of the methods of controlling government opposition when all other methods, such as detention or intimidation, have failed. It is a very rare event indeed when such assassinations are ever solved. David Webster was shot dead in front of his home on 1 May 1989. He was shot by Ferdy Barnard. You would have heard that name. So, and so we were under surveillance. Now, there was a sequel to that. When the ANC took over government, Leon and I got all sorts of invitations. The first one was to a fancy a dinner, and I didn't go, but Leon did. And they took him to a table with Mandela and the other luminaries of the ANC. He was mystified. He said, what do you think's going on? So I said, I laughed. I said, Leon, they found our files. And if we were under surveillance by the National Party, that must mean we're good guys. Now, it took them a while after, when they found that these guys, they're not our friends. All they're interested in is free markets, and that's not our game. The writing of the solution was also interesting. Charles Koch, he's a billionaire in America, two brothers, the Koch brothers. Charles Koch was in South Africa, and he called us. He was staying in a hotel in Sandton. He called the office, and I was there, and he said, I'm in town, I'd like to talk to somebody from the Free Market Foundation. So I said, okay. And as I was walking out the door, Leon arrived, so I said, come with me. So we went and met Charles Koch, and he said, what's going on in this country? So Leon spoke to him like you heard him speak now, telling him, and he said, but what's the solution? Is there a solution, or is this just going to lead to bloodshed? That's what it looks like to me. So Leon said, no. He gave him the story about devolution of power, and the Swiss system and so on. So Coke said to him, where have you written this down? Oh, Leon said, he hasn't done it. So Coke said, if you write the book, I'll fund it. And he said, well, how much? I was working in, South African terms and books that the Free Market Foundation published. Gave him a figure that was too low, but anyway. So we go back to the office. And after a couple of hours, I went to Leon's office and I said, so when are you going to start? He said, start what? I said, this book you've undertaken to write. Oh no, he said, I have this battle, I can speak, speak to an audience. I like speaking to an audience. But writing, no, it's a real bind. So I said to him, okay, I'll give you an audience. What do you mean? I said, I'll give you an audience. So I said, what chapters will there be in the book? They said, I said, write them down, please. How many will there be? 8. So he writes them down. After a couple of days, I took the scrappy piece of paper back to him. And I said, tell me, are you sure of those headings? So he said, why? I said, because I'm going to organize 8 meetings for you to address. Invite people to come and listen to you. Just make sure that those headings are correct. So he made a couple of alterations. And I organized, and I said to him, I'm going to organize it like this. Give you time to prepare. I think it was 6 weeks. But then after that, it's going to be Tuesday, Thursday, Tuesday, Thursday, Tuesday, Thursday, until the 8 talks are finished. Is that okay? Can you do it? Yes, he can do it. I said, please prepare, because once you're into it, it's going to be rough. We got good audiences, and he started off, and it went well. First, second, third, 4th chapter. By the 5th one, he was telling jokes, and he was doing all, repeating what he'd said before. It was tough. It was tougher than he had expected. But anyway, then Joan and Lillian, who was Leon's secretary at the time, they typed this up. It was a pile of paper this high. Now, what to do with this? So I phoned Leon's wife, Frances, and I said, will you tackle this? She said, no, absolutely not. We'll just fight. So I said, if you get paid for it. She said, that might make a difference. So I said, well, how much? So she tells me, I don't know what it was. So I said, okay. And I went and found funding. I said, you're on. And she went through this massive task of going through these documents. She had files and put them in the right places and made the thing follow. And then she wrote it. And that's how the solution got written. And it turned out to be an amazing book. It sold, I think at one time it was the top seller on the book sales in South Africa. So, just one thing. One thing about the Free Market Foundation, we really get overpaid. And Leon's first salary gives you an idea of what it looked like. He was appointed executive director of the FMF on 9 September 1977 at an annual salary of 4,500 Rand per annum, plus 25% of FMF income up to a gross revenue of 150,000 Rand, which would have given him 37,500 for a year. Thanks.
Leon, would you like to say any last words?
Many speeches, like my two colleagues, the William Maxey speeches, couldn't stop them. They carried
Oh
on
my
and
goodness.
This is what happens if you let Mandela's reminisce. I'm going to just make one point very briefly. The paradox of the property clause, which is in the Constitution because of our agreement with, amongst others, Cyril Ramaphosa and all the other parties. But just think of the irony that the reason they agreed to have one, the arguments we advanced, was that property rights are not for white people, but for black people who have been denied them. And it was that argument that persuaded Naledi Pandor, Cyril Ramaphosa, and others to have the property rights clause in. So the irony is that the very Cyril Ramaphosa who agreed to it to protect black people is now heading up a government that wants to remove the property rights clause, which he himself put there for that reason. This is just one of the many ironies and paradoxes we face. Not another mini speech.
No. Two people who played a really magnificent role, a major role, in the Free Market Foundation. That is Dirk Herzog and Michael O'Dowd. These two people, one from Rembrandt and the other from Anglo-American. And they were the backbone of the organization. They gave the wisdom and the background information. And I'm very pleased that today we have with us the grandson of Dirk Herzog. He's in the room with us.
Okay, I'd like to hand over to the floor. If you have any questions for Leon, Temba, or Eustace, please let's hear them. Does anyone have any questions? Nobody. Okay. No take. One. There we go.
Talked out.
Maybe just to Leon's comment a little bit earlier about some of the ANC leadership having changed their mind about the property clause in light of self-interest. Their self-interest has probably improved from a perspective of preserving that clause, I'd imagine, over the last 25 years. What's the view? What will happen?
What do you think, Leon?
I didn't hear the question. You have to repeat it, please.
Basically, what the gentleman was saying is that what's changed in the last 25 years. Because if we took the cell 25 years ago that it was in let's say, for example, Cyril Ramaphosa's self-interest to own property. What's changed since then? Because he's still a property owner now. So what's driving the expropriation without compensation now?
More so now.
Yes, it's really that the government has really believes that it has failed to bring about enough redistribution, and the reason is that people who believe in government think redistribution is something the government does. If you go to the government's, for example, housing website, the only housing it thinks black people have is housing it gave black people under RDP program. It doesn't acknowledge that the majority of housing black people they have provided for themselves. They've just simply bought property and farms and shares in the marketplace. The dirigist socialist statist mindset is that black South Africans can do nothing for themselves, and whatever happened to them is what's done for them, and it has not done, in its view, enough. The other thing is there's this narrative that floats around that white people still own most, and in particular they think it's land. That's not what the property rights clause refers to. It refers to all property, everything anyone owns, cars and houses and shares and medical schemes and savings and so on. And the belief is that black people earn very little and white people earn most. That is simply factually and objectively untrue. The advancement of black South Africans by themselves through the free market has been actually extraordinarily spectacular. In addition to that, there's what the government has indeed done, which is services. So in many black areas, there are now tar roads, and there's electricity and water and other services, health, social services, health, schooling, policing, and so on. So it's based on a factual misconception of the degree to which black South Africans have benefited from the end of apartheid by their own initiative and their own work and using their own freedom. And the other side of that coin, that government is the only source of any good that can ever come to a black person. If you think about it, it's a spectacularly racist insult to think, for black people to think that other black people can do nothing for themselves, and in fact what they do is a lot. The other issue is, of course, this business of the radical left, which feeds on this narrative. It's very popular, and that is why the EFF would have a stadium full of people, and we have, if we're lucky, a room full of people. So it is very popular to say we are going to take property from white people and give it to you black people if you support us and vote for us. Now that is popular, but it's also strangely popular, because the Property Rights Clause amendment, if there's expropriation without compensation of all property, everything anyone owns, if that is allowed, it will long outlive Cyril Ramaphosa. And what he says, that it won't harm the economy or food production or anything like that, is absolutely and completely irrelevant. The power that he is giving now to ordinary bureaucrats, and I'm going to take a little time to explain that, will outlive him, will outlive the ANC, will outlive the current discourse, and will in the end have absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with redistributing from white people to black people. It will not have a racial dimension within a few years. But the other thing is that even now, even next year, Cyril Ramaphosa will not be anywhere near an expropriation. Expropriations are done by junior government officials in every little government municipality. The Aansluit, Vergenoeg and Babananga municipal parks manager can expropriate and does expropriate land. And at the moment they have to compensate for extending the park or building a clinic or making a road or putting in a drain or whatever. That is what expropriation is done for in the real world. And in the real world, if you can do that without compensating, the victims will not be anyone sitting there in that room now. The victims will be the poor. It is not my chairman Ayanda Kumalo whose property will be taken without proper compensation. It is my retired housekeeper Gladys Nkosi, who lives in Ivory Park. When they want to extend a road or a park or something, they will take her property. She will be defenseless. Ayanda Kumalo will put up a fight, and so they won't bother him. So the victims will not be rich white farmers or rich white shareholders. The victims will be overwhelmingly, for decades, for generations to come. Not while Cyril Ramaphosa is supposedly looking after everybody. Once the power is created, the victims will be the poor, and those will be black South Africans overwhelmingly, and nobody seems to get this. It is an elementary flaw in the whole concept that this will somehow help black South Africans get wealth from white South Africans. It won't.
Other questions?
I just want to add a comment to that. I'm an estate agent here in Sandton, Bryanston, which is supposedly the richest suburb in the country. Therefore, supposedly the richest whites live here. And 4 out of 5 of my buyers are not white. About 3 out of 5 are what the government would call black African, and about 1 out of 5 is Chinese. They're doing the development. So in other words, the free market here, in a totally free market system, is transferring property from whites to blacks.
It's very, very good, very important point to have. I'd just like to wrap up and say thank you very much for attending. We've heard from Eustace, Temba and Leon, but I'd also like to thank you. If it wasn't for everyone sitting in this room here tonight, that's been with us for a large part of the 43-year journey, we wouldn't be where we are today. So thank you very much for your support. I hope it continues into the future. There are a lot of exciting projects that are on the horizon for the FMF, and I think we probably, at this point, more than ever, need it. So please carry on supporting the Free Market Foundation. Thank you very much for coming.